Hello, Mr. Carroll. I would like to start our conversation by if you could describe the genesis of film studies. What I find a bit strange is that you often say that the main reason why such thing as film became interesting and important to academia is because of economic matters. Because it became a part of popular culture, and universities understood that one way to gather students is to provide them with such a thing as film studies. Isn't there any other reason?
Well, I think that case, it probably wouldn't have the kind of popularity that it has now. In the United States, for now more than a generation, the university has been sold, so to speak, to the general public as a way of increasing one's income over a lifetime. It's considered to be a ticket into better job opportunities, and to a certain extent that is reflected. The level of unemployment among college educated during the recent COVID epidemic is much lower than the average unemployment rate of the non-college educated. Why do I say that? Well, because the universities have become and the colleges have become very big business in the United States. You know, we have probably over 4,000 colleges in the United States, and it is seen to be a kind of ticket to what was once called the middle class. I suppose now it's more like the upper middle class. So because of that, a university or college education has become coveted by a great number of people in the United States. So that means that a very diversified audience, as opposed to, say, the pre-World War II audience for university education, has changed, and the possibility of film studies is relevant to that in two respects. One, as I've said, it is a way of attracting students. English departments, for example, literature departments, realize that students would be attracted to film courses, partly because it was something they knew and liked, and also they wouldn't be put off by it, for example, as they might be hearing that the course was going to be devoted to authors they'd never heard of. So it had more attractiveness, and also, to be quite frank, it didn't demand the same level of literacy. If you were going to show popular films. So it was economically attractive. Now, of course, that's not the only factor involved. Another important factor is that in the latter part of the 20th century, you also had an audience that had been brought up on films on television. So that meant that the the professoriate, for example, people my generation, had really a great knowledge of films, if only by exposure to it. In a way, it was the art that we grew up with from our earliest days, and we were keen. We were keen to have the opportunity to talk about it. So at the same time that it was economically attractive, it was also intellectually attractive to the emerging professoriate. We grew up loving films, and a number of things began to occur. Maybe one of the most important things was the French seal of approval that the auteur theory gave us, that told us that American film, the kind of film we were growing up watching on television, was a great art. That Hitchcock was the Shakespeare of the 20th century. So we not only grew up loving film, but those of us who loved film heard that those cultural sultans in Paris had said that this was an intellectually, and not just legitimate, but vaunted endeavor, and that gave us the courage to push against the previous generations that regarded film, especially American film, mainstream film, as lowbrow, as culture of the least common denominator, and maybe even a threat to culture in general. So there was a convergence, I think, both in terms of the interest of the institutions and the passions of the emerging professoriate.
The way you described is from a viewpoint of culture, institution, and sociology. Could there be a viewpoint from epistemological standpoint, in a sense that there was a demand to understand, like when you start seeing films and when you see, just I think everyone had it in personal experience, an auteur film, let's say, and you didn't get it, like what did they see now? That's when the urge to check a book, maybe interpretation, a review of that film comes.
Well, I'm not sure I would call it epistemological, though I understand what you have in mind. I suppose in terms of the framework I was discussing, films were our beloved art. These were our loved objects, and we wanted to find out more about what we loved. And we actually wanted to broadcast our love, infect our students with similar love. So if it's epistemic, it's epistemophilia.
You wrote in one of your books that so film studies began being popular in the, if I'm correct, 60s and 70s.
Well, there were film studies programs before the Second World War, and there were film courses being taught as early as the late teens and 20s here and there. But I think for the most part, the big expansion of the institution began probably in the 60s and early 70s. The University of Southern California had a film program before World War II. There were also film courses given in theater departments before World War II. But I think the big expansions came especially in the 70s, and you began to see departments trying to establish their film programs. Famous universities like MIT and the University of Chicago, but even more importantly, state public universities began to promote film programs.
Why it became a different subject, as like a different scientific topic? Why it didn't begin as film philosophy?
Why did it begin? Well, I don't think it did begin as film philosophy. You mean why did philosophy of film begin?
No. The question is why it didn't. Film studies didn't begin as film philosophy. Why philosophy departments ignored for such a long time?
Well, part of it had to do with what I talked about or briefly mentioned earlier, that there were a long series of actually philosophical dismissals of film that had to be confronted. Adorno, for example, although Adorno is not a popular philosopher in philosophy departments in this country at the time, but people like Collingwood, and then more philosophical journalists, people like Clement Greenberg, and had very low views of film. And as going back to what I already mentioned, we think of Adorno and Horkheimer's attack on the culture industry. Now, though that's to name a number of the people whose names you would recognize, but those kinds of attacks were manifold among people whose names you wouldn't recognize now. They're long dead and forgotten. So there was a certain, let's call it philosophical resistance. Now, another point, though, that should be made is that when film studies began to emerge, it had its own philosophical wing. Many of the great film theorists were extremely well educated individuals, and they embraced film and offered philosophical defenses of it. I mean, people like Arnheim, for example. He wasn't a philosopher, he was a psychologist, but one of his first order of business was to prove that film was art. And he did that in a classically philosophical manner. So at least when film was beginning to be democratized as an object of study, part of the legitimization, part of the enfranchisement of film studies involved entering the philosophical forum. by people like Arnheim and Krakauer. So in a way, the philosophy was being done, but it was being done in the emerging film departments. One thing that happened, of course, was that, as you know, film studies at a certain point in the 70s and 80s took what was in the United States made what was called a cultural turn. And philosophical questions have been more or less put on the back burner, or if they're on the stove at all, in favor of a kind of sociological, anthropological investigations. So in a way, the film studies people left a vacuum for the philosophers to enter. And of course, there was some opportunism there because the philosophy department could now also profit from the desire that students would have to study film and television. The philosophy of film and television and philosophy in film and television. By the way, that second phrase, philosophy in, is very important. A lot of writing by philosophers on film is philosophy in. That's the phrase that I use to describe finding philosophy in film. Finding, for example, philosophical egoism in The Sopranos, or finding Nietzsche's notion of the eternal return in what's it called? You know the film I'm thinking of, Groundhog Day. So you find an expression of the myth of the eternal return in that. And what is that? Well, that's a kind of form of film interpretation, finding philosophical themes in film, and that's also something that the Cinema Studies Institution does less and less. They might offer interpretations in terms of the gender politics or the racial politics of a film, but they don't do the kind of interpretation that tries to plumb the themes and even the wisdom of works of art. It's much more politically directed by an agenda. So that's also a thing that makes the philosophy department's appropriation of this field attractive. And of course, although I have a sense you may find this a little too materialistic, I think that the attractiveness is what allows those of us who love film the opportunity to explore it.
One thing I was hoping to hear from you is that if you remember the scene on philosophy in America, United States. So if I could put it correctly, earlier Wittgenstein was God in some sense.
There was a brief period when he had a great deal of influence. I think he still has some influence, but I belong to a reading group of other philosophers, and I would say that the Wittgensteinians in the group just yesterday, just on Sunday, were bemoaning the fact that Wittgenstein no longer held quite the kind of influence that he once had. So that's true. I mean, philosophy of language has gone in a different um, direction. For my own from my own perspective, I think there's still a lot of valuable insight to be found in Wittgenstein. Um, but it's true that if you were to talk sociologically, um, uh, there has been a diminution of interest. I once taught at Cornell, and I was sitting in on one of my colleagues' classes, and the students were confronted with an argument, and they didn't really understand it, and the professor said, that's called an ordinary language argument. That used to be popular in the old days. Now, this was in Cornell, which was the capital of Wittgenstein studies in 1960. So it's very funny to have the professor say, oh, there used to be this thing somewhere called ordinary language. So that was amusing to me, and that's indicative of Wittgenstein nowadays. The students don't come into graduate school knowing Wittgenstein back and forth, unless they come from certain very specific places like the University of Chicago.
But the idea of a huge appreciation of Wittgenstein, it implies that there was a certain description of what philosophy is. So going back to my question, why philosophy departments ignored for a long time film studies, I think it would be a perfectly reasonable answer to ask someone, let's say, in 60s, in early 60s, why are you not teaching film philosophy? So the answer would be because it's not philosophy. Philosophy strives to be as similar as possible to science, and there are no epistemological questions, meaningful epistemological questions about film.
Well, I'm not sure that people would have or could have said that. After all, I mean, one central question of the philosophy of what I call the moving image rather than film is what is it? I mean, it's a basic ontological question. And by the way, earlier I was pointing out that was a philosophical question that people from Arnhem to Krakauer believed that they had to answer. Philosophy in that sense was just part of a general education. Now, it might have been that people in the early 60s, although, you know, it's hard to make these generalizations because after all, there were people like Francis Sparshot who did write on film, and there were even people in the 50s who wrote on film. Not all that widely, but I mean it was done. I think that really it was more of a cultural prejudice than a philosophical conviction. It wasn't important. You know, it wasn't central to our conception of aesthetic value. You know, there were all kinds of arguments that reading a novel, especially say a novel by Virginia Woolf or by Marcel Proust, that was an active activity that the audience had to mobilize its imagination, its emotions to engage with, whereas film was said to be just passive. So it was kind of beneath contempt because it didn't encourage the kind of engagement that true art like Picasso called for. So I think that, you know, that would be one one reason that it was ignored. So it was being ignored by the people in the philosophy department for the same reason it was being ignored by the people in the English department. But as I said, I mean, they're always philosophical questions, and again, talking about the classical film theorists like Krakauer and Arnheim, or to name someone who wasn't German, Bazin. Not only were there attempts at saying what it is, answering the question what is cinema, but also the attempts to see, well, what follows from the answer that we give. I mean, so again, I want to go back to, maybe I'm repeating myself too much, but I want to go back to the point that what we call film theorists, many of them were very philosophically informed and made film theory as philosophers. Actually, Krakauer was a philosopher. I mean, Krakauer was actually Adorno's Kant tutor.
Yeah. So the background that I see this difference between theory and philosophy is actually from reading you, because on your articles wrote in 90s, that's like period from 90s till 2000. Sometimes it's different usage in Europe or on the US. So you were always very skeptical and quite, and you convincingly argued the disadvantages of so-called grand theory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You're
Well,
not.
I was skeptical of it, but I didn't say it wasn't philosophy.
But one could get from the implication, remembering one article where you pose, let's say, a projection how it should be done, and then you compare the grand theory powered by the great gentlemen like Lacan and Barthes and others, and you say that doing it with help of cognitive science and making cognitive philosophy, one more or less gets the idea that would be more advantage.
Well, that's a specific objection to well, in that case, a kind of psychoanalysis, not grand theories. After all, Arnheim, we would call Arnheim a cognitive psychologist nowadays. I wasn't. I mean, he was a Gestalt psychologist, but a Gestalt psychologist, that's kind of cognitive approach. It's certainly not. It's certainly not an appeal to unconscious processes. So yes, I was arguing. I was arguing, and still argue that the cognitive approach is stronger, but we have to kind of consider that on a case by case basis in one respect. So, for example, not Lacan himself. I mean, Lacan didn't write film theory, but Lacanians say treated the reception of the visual image on screen as best explicated in terms of psychodynamic processes of the sort that psychoanalysis examines, and I argued that there were much better explanations in terms of the cognitive system. There was no reason to resort to the unconscious in order to explain that. I also made an argument, a general argument that I think hasn't been as successful as I hoped it would be. It's a philosophical argument, and it is that, of course, if you're a psychoanalyst, you have to first eliminate certain explanations before you move to a psychoanalytic explanations. You have to show that the behavior is not the result of somatic features. So if the subject isn't speaking, you have to make sure that she still has all the capacities, physical capacities you need to speak, and you also have to make sure that it's not the result of a cognitive deficit that someone has, like Bruce Willis is said to have now, aphasia, right? So before you begin to psychoanalyze, you have to make sure that those options are not accounting for the behavior that you're going to explain. So what does that mean? Well, if that's correct, then cognitive explanations have to be overcome before psychoanalytic ones can swing into action. Then a default condition of psychoanalyzing something is that you make sure it doesn't have a cognitive explanation. But if it does have it, you don't have to go any further. As I say, that wasn't an argument that I suppose people have universally embraced. But just to be nasty, let me point out that most of our psychoanalytic film theorists are not psychoanalysts. They don't have patience. They're not giving explanations. They're applying. They're playing. Various kinds of accounts by, so to speak, running them down the flagpole. They have these general principles, and without any empirical resort to anything empirical, they just apply them to lots of people they've never psychoanalyzed. I mean, psychoanalysis has an empirical basis. I mean, as much as I may disagree with it, I mean, Freud and practicing psychoanalysts have an empirical basis. They have their patients. They write papers on the basis of what they think they've discovered in treating patients.
Well, it depends. It depends on how you define something that is true or not. Let's say if psychoanalytic theory works for someone and it makes him feel better, I don't automatically equal it as being psychoanalytic theory true. So therapy and truth for me is different things.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, if religion makes them feel better and functioning, that doesn't prove that the gods exist.
Also, yeah, all sorts of stuff. From the empirical basis, neurosciences tells us that such thing as an unconsciousness exists, and it does hugely influence our lives.
Well, they would have to be very careful. There's what used to be called the subconscious, and then there's the unconscious. The unconscious is something that repression operates on. So, it would be wrong to say that my language or most people's knowledge of their language is unconscious. Many people couldn't tell you about the grammatical principles that are leading them to treat certain things as objects of prepositions or passive voice. I mean, somebody might be surprised to learn, oh, that sentence was in the passive. So there are many principles that people master that, as I said, we used to call subconscious, or we might call tacit. That means that we don't have access to them, but they're not unconscious in the psychoanalytic sense. Unconscious in the psychoanalytic sense means they're repressed. And I'm not sure that neuroscience gives us evidence of repression. It certainly gives us knowledge, if we ever needed it, that there are lots of things that we depend upon. Grammatical principles is my example now, that we can't put forward, but we know them. We just don't have conscious access to them. But
no, definitely they are not. The epithet of repressed doesn't exist in that vocabulary. That's why they
no,
even.
I don't think they could take an MRI and say, "Oh, that circuit is a repressed circuit."
Yeah. That's why they even sometimes prefer to use the word not conscious. Just it is not unconscious, to avoid all the psychoanalytic connotations.
Yes, of course. Yes. So as I said, there's. It is true that there were some philosophers some time in the past who doubted the existence of the subconscious. There are, Descartes at least seems to think that all of our thoughts are transparent to us. Maybe he didn't think that. I'm not a Descartes scholar, but certainly we read in Freud, for example, that he thought he had to defend the notion of his unconscious, but he was defending it against the notion of any kind, the denial of any sort of non-conscious thinking.
True. And just I understand why the argument that you made could be easily, how to say, criticized by a psychoanalytic. He would just simply say that all your cognitive explanation is a strategy of defending your repressed unconsciousness, as how they say that, the Popper argument, that he says that it's impossible to falsificate, if that's the word, anything that psychoanalysis says, because in the end, the argument against psychoanalysis is just a strategy to defend yourself from the truth of unconsciousness.
Well, fair enough, but that really is a kind of name calling.
It's ancient metaphysics. It's like,
well, it's also the case that it's an accusation. It would have to be substantiated in one sense or another. So that would mean that they would have to psychoanalyze me for free. I wouldn't have to pay for it. After all, it's in their interest to discover what my early parenting has led me to resist being psychoanalyzed.
You mentioned about how it was important for the classical film theorists to define what is film. One of their main intentions was to establish a simple thesis that film is art.
Yes.
But the other notion that you strongly advocate is anti-essentialistic notion. Is that you don't think it's worth of trying to define, to give a final definition of what is film, or as you like to say, moving images. And I tried it a lot. I tried it a lot just to think and just make a 2 or 3 sentence definition. I couldn't come up. There's always some kind of empirical evidence that doesn't get in that definition. But so the question that follows from it: what gives an identity to film philosophy?
What gives identity to it? I suppose you're going to think this is a cheap answer, but if you're let's go back to Wittgenstein. If you're going to deny essentialism, as Wittgenstein did, you're still a philosopher. Anti-essentialism is a philosophical position. So that's the cheap answer, and of course people like Wittgenstein and other anti-essentialists have demonstrated that, look, for most of our concepts, especially everyday concepts, Wittgenstein's example was games. For most of our everyday concepts, like chair, we don't have essential definitions. We acknowledge there are borderline cases. I don't think that there's a problem. And in fact, I mean, as early as Plato's dialogues, in discussing Plato's dialogues, people have presented what they call the Socratic fallacy. Socrates goes around the agora, asking people, what is justice, etc. They give him some answers. He shoots them down, and the presupposition is, if you can't define it, you don't know what justice is. But that seems actually what Wittgenstein and others are claiming is fallacious. In the sense that in order to know how to use a term like pipe, for example, you don't have to have an essential definition of what a pipe is. A tube in which you can burn tobacco, or whatever you want to call it a definition. It causes it is a kind of instance of a generic fallacy. In order to know something, you don't have to know that you know it. Descartes thought that you had to know things. You had to know that you knew them. So you had to come up with a foundation for that, and eventually he traced it back to God's benevolence. That was what gave him the foundation. And if he could prove God existed and God was benevolent, then he could know that he knew things. But it is an epistemic, an epistemological flaw to think that in order to know something you have to know that you know it. Or in other words, for that is that you have to be certain of something. To know something, you have to be certain that it's the case, and that just sets the bar too high.
So how can we explain that film philosophy is something different than cultural studies or media studies? Where does the difference come from?
Well, as I said, I mean, nowadays it doesn't seem to me that ontological questions are that important in media studies, or when I went to film school, it was film studies, and and the question of what is film, and especially with the inflection that you've already mentioned, not only saying that what film was, but actually showing that it could be art, was crucial. It was crucial in order to enfranchise film studies programs. Um, Film studies programs had to show that they were that film was something unique. It was different from the other arts, and therefore would not be adequately treated in the English department or the theater department. It was it wasn't just an idle philosophical pastime. You had to go before the administration and say, look, this is something that's unique. This is what film is. This is why it has the capacity to be art. That and because it is an art on its own terms, it needs its own institution to study it. So actually, right there, what I've just added to our conversation is there was a commitment to medium specificity. That film not only was something specific, and it was a specific art, and following the dictates or the principle of medium specificity, it was a unique art, and thus would not be adequately understood as a stepsister of literature or theater. And actually, you made an interesting and completely legitimate slippage in the way you posed your question. You went from film to media. And of course, one thing that's characteristic of what we might call film departments now is that they don't want to be uniquely film departments. They want to be media departments. They want to deal with television. They want to deal with all sorts of new platforms like your cell phone. They don't. They're not interested in being just film. So organizations like Cinema Studies are now Cinema Studies and Media. And there are good reasons. There are good reasons for that. I mean, when I got on board, so to speak, we were thinking mostly of film in terms of well, for the most part, fiction films or the kinds of films that would be shown in theaters. That was what film was to us. Whereas now, that's only part of the world of the moving image. The moving image in various ways has invaded every part of our lives. Look, we're talking on Zoom now. This is a moving image too. So it's understandable that given how the moving image has become essential to so many different forms of communication in so many different ways, that people don't want to just restrict the investigation, to what, for want of a better word, I'll call movies. I mean, there are moving images everywhere in buses. I don't know in Lithuania, but I went to the doctor on Friday, and there are two big television screens in the waiting room for the doctor, they weren't showing movies or what I would call movies. They were talk shows and game shows and all sorts of different things. So I'm usually browbeating film departments and telling them, oh, what you're doing is wrong. But it makes perfect sense given the growing and expanding importance of the moving image in every aspect of our lives. That the purview has to be, or it's reasonable to expand the purview, and have people, who are studying video games rather than, I don't know, brilliant art films like Parasite.
I would like to ask you about important distinction that you mentioned before. It's about philosophy about film or philosophy in film. When we read the Plato's dialogues and in general the beginning of philosophy, popular description is that the Greek Enlightenment began when rational arguments made for convincing someone changed just brute force. That's when democracy begins, right? When you try to convince someone, appealing to the reason by your words, by arguments specifically. And that's the beginning of philosophy, one of the narratives, let's say. Where do
Well,
we find?
I wouldn't. I don't think I would be satisfied with this just because one of the great opponents, or at least designated by Socrates as opponents, were the sophists. And of course, the sophists were training people to make arguments to persuade them. What vexed Socrates about that was that they were arming them with arguments, irrespective of what their clients' commitment was to truth. They were training people to sway, for example, the people in the assembly that condemned Socrates, so that Sophists could be described in the way that you broadly described the birth of philosophy. Actually, I would say philosophy, if we're locating it in Plato, began by confronting sophists, by confronting, persuasive arguments with a demand for true arguments.
I would agree with you, especially I've read recently there is this new, quite important edition of early Greek philosophy made by Cambridge, and they, on the section of sophists, they put Socrates, arguing that he lived at the same time when they flourished, and he had a lot of connection with that time popular sophists. And only Plato starts philosophy tradition by referring that arguments has to be based not on conviction, as someone who, like Rorty, would agree here, that a good argument is the one that convinces most of the people, but as referring to some kind of truth. So we know that for Plato it was his theory of ideas that was the ultimate referential.
Well, okay. I mean, I was speaking loosely. I meant to be speaking of Plato's Socrates. After all, Socrates, the historical Socrates, went through a number of different positions. People are always surprised when they read Aristophanes or see Aristophanes, the clouds, because Socrates there as being a he's being made fun of for having these kind of fancy metaphysical ideas, and that's not the Socrates that we know from Plato. But apparently, the historical Socrates was involved in the kind of metaphysical speculation that Thales and Parmenides and Anaxagoras were involved in. But then he changed, and he's the Socrates that we know from Plato. You know, Socrates historically is one thing. I perhaps being a bit shoddy and not a good historian when I'm talking about Socrates. I'm talking about the one I know from Plato. So I could see. I don't know if I'd go as far as to call him a sophist. I might put a question mark.
I mean, yeah, it's a thesis that I think one of the reasons why they did that is just to have a conversation going around, to get some attention on their new edition.
Yeah. Well, I think actually, though they were more precise than I was, they were saying the same thing I was saying about the beginning, not just with arguments, but with arguments that are committed to discovering or articulating the truth.
So when can we apply this mechanism to films? Arguments who are discovering or showing truth?
Oh, well, yeah, certain films, most notably, most straightforwardly, documentaries. They're committed to that. Now, you know, the tendency in discussions of documentary, especially by film people, they look askance at claims like that because of course what they're mostly interested still in what I would call artistic films. The people who are interested in documentaries are interested in you know, non-fiction films, but not just any non-fiction films, ones that have certain kind of artistic claims. I mean, I mentioned Jonas Mekas. Well, he makes a film about his visit to Lithuania. It's a non-fiction film, but it's also a very artistic film. You know, as soon as we get into the terrain of art, people are going to say, "Oh, well, look, that's not objective; that's subjective." But look, there are an awful lot of films that are much more plain. The documentary film that's on your viewer in the airplane when you land in a city, and they explain to you what you have to do to get through the passport line. You know, that's a film too, or films about films about wildlife, films about these documentaries, these very simple, matter of fact documentaries. That, you know, they tell the truth. Now, maybe you're thinking the truth with a capital T, you know, what's the meaning of life? But in terms of the kinds of truths that we talk about every day, that we're on a Zoom meeting right now, there's that kind of small T truth, it is certainly within the reach of many films. And there may even be, fiction films may even possibly be capable of delivering certain truths about human behavior or human life. That might be something that would take a lot more defense than talking about ordinary documentaries. But the fact that there are those ordinary, mundane documentaries is enough to get us the possibility of truth. And then the next job is to see how far it can go. But, you know, I always think that cheap arguments are important. First, you have to have the, you know, this is a maybe too militaristic a way of talking, but first you have to take the beachhead before you move inland.
Because when I've read a few articles, mostly written by analytic philosophers, there's a small controversy that there is a fundamental difference when we speak about not truth in film or in philosophy or in other academic discourse, but about the specificity of argument as itself. That in text, in written or spoken language, we can see an argument or hear it or read it. But in film, there is always a middleman. And that middleman is called interpretation.
Well, the first thing you want to ask is whether or not the premise of that argument is true. If it's true, we were earlier speaking of Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein, at least of the philosophical investigations, is not a philosopher. Where's the argument? He leaves it up to the reader to figure out where these examples, where these questions are pointing. So and now the question is this an empirical claim about philosophy? What doesn't seem to be, because we can come up with a number of examples of people who are thought of as philosophers who don't have arguments. Nietzsche has aphorisms. Wittgenstein has questions and examples. So empirically, it's not true that an argument is a requirement. Is okay. So it's not empirically true. Is it kind of philosophically true, where that's
conceptual?
Yes. Is that what it is? Okay. Well, what's the argument? I mean, it's true that there are philosophers who bandy that about. Are they being responsible philosophers, or are they just assuming what they're supposed to be proven? So that's the first response to that view. The second thing is, look, it's not true that there are never any arguments in films. They might not be good arguments, but you know, if the only things that count are arguments are good ones, then a lot of us philosophers are going to be out of business. and half of our business is showing why the other half of philosophers' arguments aren't any good. So, you know, look, my general response to this, not only with film but also with fictions in general, is there's an argument, but actually these philosophers are looking in the wrong place. The argument is what the audience does. I mean, the audience is shown something and thinks about it, and asks themselves, what does this mean? Uh, and then they think on the basis of their own experience, um, whether it's convincing or not. By the way, just think of in newspapers, there are what we call op-ed pieces, kind of editorial pieces that say this or that about various things. Um, they leave it up to the audience to look on their own experience and their own knowledge resources to fill out the argument, right? So I don't know. Now in the news today, there's a lot of news from Ukraine, and one thing that's being suggested is that there have been a lot of atrocities that the Russians have committed. Uh, and I've heard it now several times, and I've read it that they say this is part of the modus operandi of the Russians. That this is how they wage war. They kill civilians. Okay, now the article doesn't prove that. Um, I have to confirm that on my own. Does that sound plausible to me about what I know of, say, Soviet behavior during World War II when they swept across Eastern Europe? Is this what I know of about what the Russians did in Chechnya, in Afghanistan? I mean, I have to fill it in, so often, even with writing, even when you see the claim, it's up to the reader to examine that, and if the reader thinks it's the case, to supply the evidence. So I think that very often the what I call the no argument, uh, they look for the wrong place for the argument. They look they look to see it literally in the film, whereas it's the film as it engages the intellectual resources of the audience. Sometimes, well, I don't know if you know the old program, The Twilight Zone. It was a kind of science fiction fantasy sort of thing, and each of the shows had some kind of moral, right? And so the moral would be pronounced. Sometimes fairy tales are this way, or Aesop's fables. So you get the conclusion and you get an example. It's up to you to see if the example fits the conclusion. So actually, you are kind of reconstructing an argument, and that's not hard to see. You can know what the conclusion is or what the viewpoint, what the thesis of a film is, and then you can say, well, does the example fit it, and does it fit it well, or is the example just irrelevant? That is to say, you scrutinize it critically, which is what this demand for an argument is really calling for. There isn't a critical retrospection, but there is, and it's in the mind of the reflective audience. Very often, very often it's social. After the film, you go out with your friends. Your friends offer various interpretations. You argue about which is the right interpretation, and before you know it, your discussion has escalated into whether or not you think the interpretation is true or false.
Would that apply also to literature?
Sure.
Yeah.
Although, look, it's even more obvious. It's even more obvious that within literature, you can have arguments, right? Look at Dostoevsky. You have arguments there.
Mm-hmm. Quite colorful ones.
Yes, and philosophically powerful. I mean, what about the argument of, can there be a God who allows the Turks to slaughter innocents? Wouldn't it be scandalous to say that these innocents should be slaughtered so that I have free choice? Why do they have to pay for it? I mean, that's one of the most powerful arguments against God's, or at least the Christian God's existence. It's right in the middle of a novel. And, there are lots of other arguments there. I'm just taking that one as an example because, that's the one that we reprint in philosophy textbooks, in anthologies. We use that to teach the argument from evil to our undergraduates. They just take it right out of the novel. And then there are many examples of novels with maybe not so good arguments, like I don't know, Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. That certainly has an argument in it. So yes, I mean, literature. It's even more blatant in literature because there are. It's just false to say, oh, in literature there aren't any arguments. I mean, Tolstoy's War and Peace has a whole philosophy of history that he repeats in it. And of course, there's lots of true stuff in literature. Melville's Moby Dick has a whole chapter about whales, and that chapter about whales was about as accurate as you could be scientifically about whales during his lifetime.
And also very prognostic for me about humans' place in the world. Yeah, actually, I have a colleague who's writing a dissertation from a Russian philosopher, Lev Shestov. Actually, he was born in Ukraine. But whenever I ask him, so who's the most important Russian philosopher? Not only him, but all the Russian philosophers says Dostoevsky.
Yeah.
Says,
Well, Nietzsche and Freud both thought he was the best psychologist.
you were speaking a bit earlier about philosophical investigations, Wittgenstein's. So it's usually called late Wittgenstein. And he had a very interesting reception. What I want to ask you about a scholar named Stanley Cavell, and his book, which I really like, and in general his work on cinema. But the question is, he wrote his book. I think the first edition was in '68, if I'm right, the anthology of film.
Yes,
and then
I think that's right.
And then the second one I think was '71. But from just reading articles and monographs and books, one gets an impression that his popularity became popular only in the beginning of 2000. Am I right? Is this the right impression?
I mean, I think you need to make a distinction. I think he's been popular among literature departments longer than that. I don't know if you would call him popular. I mean, his reception among philosophers was mixed. One issue just has to do with his writing style, which even in, if you remember, in The World Viewed, he talks about how he likes to say things his own way, and because he said things his own way, I think that many people, many philosophers thought, well, they didn't get it. I've just published a book called Philosophy in the Moving Image, and I have an article on Stanley Cavell's World Viewed in that, and I tried to actually show how, in fact, the book is structured in a very classical way. It begins with the question, what is film? It tries to tell you what film is in terms of automatic world projections. Then he goes into all the various kinds of ingredients in film, actors, and I don't have to keep going on. Genres, where do genres come from? He asks what is film, and then he analyzes the constituents of film as he sees them in light of in light of his reigning idea about automatic world projections, and how does he finish, at least in the, not more of the world view, but in the first one, the 68 one, he tells us what he started out saying he was going to do. He tells us why he thinks film is important, and that's because it gives us a symbol uh, against the temptation of solipsism, against the temptation of thinking that we're the only thing that exists. Because when we look at these automatic world projections, we know that there's a world without us. So, I mean, I now I don't agree with him from the start, but I will defend that book as unmistakably philosophical. Now, I think in many respects that was not obvious to the philosophical institution, because it wasn't the kind of writing that they were used to, and it didn't use philosophical cues. It didn't say what is the essence of film, right? There wasn't much of an uptake, and I think the book is still regarded, and he's regarded as a difficult read. But so what? Kant's a difficult read. Um, so I think that's one reason for it. He always has had uh, um, some influence and some followers in film, and even among film philosophers. Um, uh, uh, Among other things, although I know you probably think I'm too materialist in this way, he was a professor at Harvard, and Harvard is very good at placing its students. So he did, I shouldn't use this term, but he did send a number of acolytes out in the world who had their own acolytes. So he's always had a presence in philosophy of film. And I'm going to say something maybe a little radical now. He has had an influence that's not an obvious influence, but I think we have to respect him in this regard. Earlier, I said, that a lot of what is published as philosophy in terms of film is philosophy in film. That is, discovering philosophical themes in films. That's where this argument comes up about, oh, is it really philosophy if it doesn't have an argument? Right. So that's philosophy in film, and from the Pursuits of Happiness, the book, The Pursuits of Happiness onward, um, a lot of what he did was philosophy in film, and uh, he made the world safe for philosophy in film. And I think that a lot of people who do philosophy in film wouldn't think that they were the progeny of Stanley Cavell, but it was something that he did, wearing his hat, so to speak, as a philosopher. I mean, you see it in the Pursuits of Happiness. He uses film to talk about the nature of romantic love. Uh, think of his discussion of bringing up baby and his emphasis on the importance of play to romance. So I think that he's had more influence than people realize in philosophy, and I also think that in many cases the people are dismissive of his work as philosophy because they don't recognize it as the language of philosophy, or at least to say, um, the reigning uh, language of philosophy among Anglophone philosophers. I mean, when you read me, you know that it's philosophy because I put up all of the signposts, including, citing the people I'm arguing with, and sometimes numbering my arguments. There's no mistaking at least what I want to be taken as. But Stanley Cavell is more he's not as obvious. But I would say, in terms of his philosophy of film in the world viewed, and I tried to prove this in my book, um, it, it's really a classically structured philosophical treatise, even though it doesn't look like one and it doesn't sound like one.
Do you see advantages of writing like that? Because I absolutely agree with you. It's like just going beyond surface, and it's for me it was also very classical and as a foundational book, and there's a strong continuity towards his other books, what he does. So I don't see a huge shift actually between his last works on film on the beginning and
Well,
the ones.
you're absolutely right. After all, some of what I'm talking about as philosophy in film, there are sides, and there are digressions, and there are examples that are philosophy in film, where he talks. I mean, he talks about what we might broadly call the theme of the film, and he makes critical remarks all of the times about specific films. So, yeah, I think that's completely legitimate. It's already there, although it's not quite as dominant, I think, as it is in some of the other of his works, like Pursuits of Happiness, or the melodrama book. I forget the title of it. The Unknown Woman, is that the title of it? Well,
No, no.
well, and then of course there's the book that's a series of lectures on eminent philosophers and films that are connected with them. It's Cities on the.
Words,
Say again.
cities of words.
That's right. Yeah.
So Carroll, he had one line on how to do philosophy. You advocated, as I mentioned before, cognitive methodology, if that's right. Did it become popular? People doing philosophy using cognitive tools given by cognitive sciences?
Um, let's see.
Because you never did. You were always from the meta standpoint, and you always wrote about how should the philosophy be done, and what are the trajectories, and what are the mistakes of the past. So you always very like, that's what I like about your work. but you never did the field work, as they say.
No, I never. That's true. I've never done field work. I've done it. I've done it, as they say, from the armchair, or maybe not the armchair. Maybe the seat in the cinema.
Yeah, the best one, the best place to do philosophy.
But I mean, I have done. I have offered hypotheses that depend on at least my referring to uh, uh, cognitive and perceptual psychology. Um, I mean, for example, I discuss the kind of evidence there is in the literature for my thesis that what a film image is what I call a recognitional prompt. That we use the set of perceptual resources that we use to recognize things in everyday life, to recognize what the pictorial images of film are pictures of, and I reference all kinds of data, experimental and otherwise. For example, I discussed the case of the two psychologists who raised a child with no images, and then at a certain date showed him photographic images, and they recorded the speed at which he was able to recognize correctly what those were images of. And I use that, for example, as evidence that shows what's wrong with the idea that pictorial recognition is a kind of code-like language, because of the speed with which this child was capable of recognizing what the images were, compared to the amount of time it takes to um, recognize what the words are in a language. In other words, language acquisition, which is a paradigmatic example of assimilating a code, compared to the speed with which it appears one is capable of mastering what pictures represent just by looking. So there's an argument. I didn't do the experiment, but I used that experiment as a way of arguing what at one time was almost accepted as given by semiologists. And I can give other examples of where I've used psychological evidence that way. My theory of point of view editing is based on not experiments that I've done, but ethological and perceptual psychological views of human perception, and uh, how, among other things, we follow our conspecifics. When we see someone looking at something, we look at what they're looking at. We do that because looking at what people are looking at is one way that we learn about what they're thinking and what they're intending. And there's lots of evidence that we do that. And my hypothesis about point of view editing, to make it very short and not argue for it at length, is that what point of view editing is based on that innate perceptual disposition to follow a person's glance to its object. I also, well, maybe I do have one experiment. I remind people of when I was a kid. My friends and I would like to stand in front of the building in New York and look up. And all the passerbys would come up. They would try and see what we were seeing up there. So that was my unscientific experiment.
And did it get popular? Can we say that this is like one of the dominating ways of doing film philosophy?
Well, I wouldn't say film philosophy. I mean, there is a society now. It's very active in Europe called the Society for the Cognitive Study of the Moving Image, and that's made up of film people, historians, and film critics, perceptual psychologists, and philosophers. Now, when I was urging that more attention be paid towards cognitive science, I wasn't suggesting that as simply a philosophical view, but that cognitive science be taken seriously by everyone who is interested in explaining things about film. And of course, cognitive science is not a philosophy itself. There are many different kinds of cognitive science approaches, and they don't all agree with each other. So cognitive science is pluralistic, and I was recommending to various populations, and to a certain extent, it has taken hold. There is a journal called Projections, which is for the most part a journal that publishes things in let's call it, broadly speaking, cognitive studies. So cognitive studies is a discernible uh, force group. I don't know exactly the right word. Formation in cinema studies in the United States and also in Europe, in Germany, and in Scandinavia. You see a great deal of the people at these conferences are what should I call it? Nordic. And so yes, I think it has taken up, been taken up. Um, Philosophers, well, the first thing is the number of philosophers of film. I don't know. I think they say there are 13,000 professors of philosophy in the United States. I don't know if that's true, but the philosophers of film are not a big majority among that
Mhm.
group.
Of course, of course.
So I don't. And then how many of them are cognitive scientists or cognitively moved? I don't know. I mean, my general position is that philosophies ought to be um, familiar with the best science of their day as it's relevant to what they're doing. Uh, we shouldn't be philosophizing completely ignorant. We shouldn't be saying the moon is made of blue cheese or green cheese or whatever. We should make sure that we're not philosophizing in such a way that the best science of the day uh, uh, would refute it. Um, on the other hand, I'm not saying that we have to always accept the best science of the day, but if we don't accept it, we have to have criticisms of it. You know, many philosophers were suspicious of behaviorism when it ruled American psychology departments. That might have had a claim to be the best science of the day. But of course, philosophers like Chomsky didn't agree with it, but they came up with arguments against it that were evidence based.
I totally agree with you. I think one of the weakest points in continental philosophy is their ignorance of science.
Yes, I mean, I think if you read Lyotard on postmodernism, he completely misunderstands how science operates. Uh, um, he thinks that the fact that it's dialectical shows that it's something like poetry, rather than that the effort of questioning and falsifying theories as they're presented is really an epistemic. It's an epistemic instrument. It's not. It's not. Uh, it's not an art in the sense that poetry is an art.
The same as Delos. He has great books on cinema. I really, really like them. That when he speaks about science as uh, as modalities, we through which we see reality. So he has like a great understanding of art in general. But when it comes to
Who, who is
science,
this?
Gilles Delos,
Oh,
Deleuze,
Duluth. I see. Okay.
Deleuze.
We have different opinions of Deleuze. So my problem with Deleuze is that, um, basically, in my view, he basically reinvents the wheel. He just gives it different names. So his first volume is really relying on the insights of silent film theorists like Arnheim and Eisenstein, and the second volume is really the beneficiary of insights by people like Bazin and Krakauer. He invents a new Bergsonian vocabulary, but I'm not sure that it says anything other than what had been said by previous theorists. I may be very uncharitable here, so you can correct me, but I felt I felt it was his theoretical stance is more a matter of repackaging than discovery.
And also politicizing. While he's not explicitly saying that it's political books,
Uh,
one cannot get out of the impression that its first book is about authoritarian regimes, second book is about democracy.
yeah, good point. Good point. Of course, that's implicit. At least your description of the second book is kind of implicit in my association of him with Bazin and Krakow. I always wanted to write an article, by the way, that would begin by saying, you know what Christian Metz said? Après moi, Deleuze.
Which means
Well, in French, it's a pun on après moi, Deluge, after me, the flood.
we will be waiting for that article.
I don't, now that people know that I want to make that terrible joke, they're just going to reject the article without even reading it.
What's your take first on such a practice as philosophy of moving images or film philosophy? Where do you think the discourse will go? What's the most hot topics?
Well, I'm not sure, but I think in terms of whatever we're going to call this field, what is going to have to be the job of philosophers and theorists is to try and catch up with the proliferation of kinds and uses of moving images. I'm going back to what we talked about earlier. I mean, we used to go to the movie theater like we used to go to church. It was a very specific location. That's where you saw the movies. Then there were televisions, and we would turn that. That would be in a special room, and we would turn it on and watch it during one time again. Again, it was located someplace. Now it's everywhere. It's on your phone. It's on your computer. Instead of there being billboards, now there are motion picture billboards everywhere. They're in the subway. I said they're in my doctor's office. They're in the dentist's office. Everywhere you go, there are different platforms and different kind of material that's being communicated essentially by moving images. By moving images supplemented with talk. There's Skype. There's Zoom. There's Instagram. I mean, again, the proliferation of platforms and uses is making it so omniscient. Not omniscient, omnipresent. That beginning to develop theoretical frameworks. One thing I actually agree with Deleuze about. In his book, What is Philosophy? He says that one well, he doesn't say this. He says something, of course, much more general and much grander than what I would say. He says that what philosophy is about the invention of concepts that we need. I would say one office of philosophy, one job description of one thing philosophers do is create concepts as we need them. I mean, my concept of the moving image, my urging that we talk about that rather than film, is an attempt, a modest attempt by me to actually get a concept and a conceptualization that better fits what we're talking about now that we're in the era of computer generated images than talking about film. So I agree with him about that. Not that I would go as wide as he does, and also I can't resist saying something nasty, and that is simply that explains why he's always changing the names of things with his kind of Bergsonian vocabularies. Not that I have anything against Bergson, but in any case, getting back to where you what should I say? Evoke this rant on my part. I think that the future is going to be coming up with the conceptual frameworks we need. It used to be said that well, especially by film people, it used to be said that cinema was the art of the 20th century. And now, because when people think of cinema, they're thinking of the kinds of things that used to show up in movie theaters, and they're saying, well, maybe not so much anymore. But actually, once you realize that what we're talking about is the moving image, it looks like the moving image is going to be maybe the most vividly present medium of the 21st century, and that's going to be the job of theorists and philosophers to catch up with it.
Yeah, there is some
And
space.
by the way,
for that.
it's not going to be me. It's not going to be me. I'm too old. It's got to be you,
Professor Carroll, thank you very much for your time and for the conversation.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun.